The room is dark. Not completely, but almost. The lamps have been turned down. The windows are covered. The city outside has gone quiet. Inside, there is only stillness and a faint light. At first, it is barely visible, a soft green shimmer, so weak that your eyes struggle to hold it. Then, slowly, shapes begin to appear. A glass tube on a wooden table, a small dish near the edge, dust scattered like powder across the surface. They are glowing, not brightly, not like fire, not like a flame, something softer, something colder. The light does not flicker. It does not move. It simply exists, as if the objects themselves are alive. The air feels heavy, the kind of silence that fills a place where people have been working for too long. This is not a finished laboratory. It is not clean, no polished surfaces, no perfect instruments. The tables are worn. The equipment is improvised. Glass, metal, and wood arranged with care, but without luxury. This is a place built from necessity, not comfort. At the center of the room stands a woman. She does not speak, she watches. Her eyes adjust slowly to the dark. She leans slightly forward, studying the faint glow as if it might disappear if she looks away. Her hands are still, but not relaxed. There is tension in the way she holds herself. The kind of focus that comes from years of waiting, years of repetition, years of doing the same work again and again with no guarantee that it will lead anywhere. She has seen failure more than once, more than most. The glow is new, or at least, it feels new. She moves closer to the table, carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect. The materials in front of her are not fully understood. They do not behave like anything she has studied before. They do not wait for heat. They do not depend on light. They do not respond to the usual rules. They simply continue, quietly, steadily, as if something inside them refuses to stop. She reaches toward the glass tube, then pauses. Not hesitation, consideration. She has learned to observe before acting, to notice the smallest changes, a difference in color, a slight increase in brightness, a reaction that takes hours instead of minutes. This work does not reward speed, it rewards patience. So she waits and watches. The glow remains, unchanged, uninterrupted. There is something unsettling about it, a kind of persistence that does not belong to ordinary materials. Most things fade, most things cool, most things come to rest. This does not. It continues to emit light, even in complete darkness, as if it carries its own source of energy, as if the darkness has no effect on it at all. She does not yet have a name for what she is seeing. There is no clear explanation, no established theory that fully accounts for this behavior, only fragments, observations, measurements, questions, many questions. She turns away from the table and walks slowly across the room. The floor creaks beneath her steps. A notebook rests near the edge of another table. Pages filled with careful handwriting, numbers, dates, repeated experiments, small variations, each one recorded, each one compared. This is how she works, not with sudden inspiration, but with accumulation, layer after layer of effort, until something begins to stand out. She picks up the notebook, flips through the pages. There are no dramatic moments written here, no declarations, no certainty, only persistence, only the quiet record of someone who refuses to stop. She returns to the table. The glow is still there, waiting. She studies it again, longer this time, trying to understand not just what it is, but what it means. If this light comes from within the material itself, then something deeper is happening, something that does not fit within the known limits of physics, something that suggests that matter is not as stable as it seems, that it can change, that it can release energy without burning, without being consumed. The idea is difficult to accept, not because it is impossible, but because it changes too much. It challenges the foundation of what scientists believe about the nature of matter. And yet, the evidence is here, on the table, quietly glowing. She does not rush to conclusions. She does not announce anything, not yet, because she understands something important. Observation comes first, understanding comes later, and sometimes, understanding takes years. She reaches out again. This time, she lifts the small dish slightly, adjusting its position under the faint light. The glow shifts, just a little, enough to confirm what she has already begun to suspect. This is not an illusion. This is not a reflection. This is something real, something measurable, something that can be studied, the kind of discovery that begins quietly, almost invisibly, before anyone else notices, before the world understands what it is, before anyone can see where it will lead. She places the dish back on the table, carefully. Then steps back. The room returns to stillness. The faint green light remains, unchanged, unexplained. She stands there for a moment longer, watching, thinking. Then she turns away. There is more work to do, more experiments to repeat, more data to collect. This is only the beginning. She does not know how far this will go. She does not know what it will become. She does not know what it will cost. For now, there is only the glow, and the question it carries. What is this, and what does it mean? The answer will not come quickly. It will take years. It will require patience, endurance, and a willingness to continue, even when the path is unclear. Because what she is looking at is not just light. It is something deeper, something hidden, something the world has never seen before. She does not yet have the words for it, but she is close, very close. She is discovering something the world could not yet understand. Before the laboratory, there was a different kind of confinement. Not walls, not chains, but limits that were harder to see. She was born in a place where knowledge was controlled, where learning was not always encouraged, where opportunity depended on who you were and where you came from. Her name was Marie Curie, but she was not born with that name. She was born Maria Skłodowska in Warsaw, at a time when Poland did not fully belong to itself. The country had been divided, controlled by larger empires, and under that control, education was not free. Not for everyone, certainly not for her. From the beginning there was expectation, not of greatness, but of limitation. What she could study, where she could go, what she could become. These were not questions she could answer alone. They had already been decided. Her father was a teacher, a man who believed in learning, who valued knowledge even when it was restricted. He filled their home with books, instruments, ideas, even when it was not easy, even when resources were limited, even when the system around them did not support it. Education in that house was not optional. It was necessary, not for status, but for survival. Maria learned early, not just from lessons, but from watching, from observing how knowledge could exist quietly, even when it was discouraged. There were rules. Certain subjects could not be taught openly. Certain ideas could not be shared freely. So they were passed along in other ways, privately, carefully, sometimes in secret. There were classes that did not officially exist, meetings that were not meant to be noticed, a hidden network of learning, where students gathered to study subjects that were restricted. This was how she continued, not in grand institutions, but in rooms where knowledge had to be protected. It required discipline and caution. To learn under those conditions was not simple. It demanded more than interest. It required commitment, because every lesson carried risk. But she stayed. She listened. She absorbed everything she could. There was no guarantee that it would lead anywhere. No clear path forward. Especially for her, because she was not just limited by politics, she was limited by expectation. Women were not expected to pursue advanced education, not seriously, not professionally. There were boundaries, unwritten but enforced. Certain ambitions were considered unrealistic, even inappropriate, so the choices were narrow, teaching or nothing. But she did not accept that, not fully. She continued to study, even when there was no official place for her, even when the path ahead was unclear. There was something steady in her approach, not defiance, not rebellion, but persistence, a quiet refusal to stop. Her family faced difficulty, financial strain, loss. Life did not become easier as she grew older. If anything, it became more complicated. There were responsibilities, expectations, practical concerns that could not be ignored. Education was important, but it was not free. And for someone in her position, it was not easily accessible. So she made a decision, not a dramatic one, not a sudden change, but a plan. Careful, long-term. She and her sister agreed to help each other. One would work, the other would study. Then they would switch. It was not an ideal solution, but it was possible. And sometimes, possible is enough. Maria chose to wait, to work, to support her sister's education first, while putting her own plans on hold. This was not a short delay. It would take years, years of working as a governess, living in other people's homes, teaching children, following routines that were not her own. It was steady work, but it was not the work she wanted. Her days were structured, predictable, quiet, but her mind was elsewhere, on books, on ideas, on questions she could not yet explore fully. At night, she studied, alone, using whatever materials she could find, reading, practicing, continuing her education without formal guidance. There was no audience, no recognition, no immediate reward, only progress, slow, private, invisible. This is how her foundation was built, not in lecture halls, but in borrowed time, in moments between responsibilities, in effort that no one else could see. Years passed. Her sister completed her studies. The agreement had been fulfilled. Now it was her turn. But the path was still uncertain, because even with preparation, there were still barriers. The place she needed to go was far from Warsaw, far from everything familiar. Paris. It was not just another city. It was a different world, a place where universities were open to women, where study was possible, where she could continue, if she could get there. But leaving was not simple. It meant distance, separation, uncertainty. There would be no safety net, no guarantees, only the possibility of something more. She did not leave immediately. She prepared, saved what she could, gathered what she needed, and waited for the right moment. Because leaving is not just a physical act, it is a decision, to step away from what is known, without knowing exactly what comes next. When the time came, it was quiet. No ceremony, no announcement, just departure. She left Warsaw behind, her home, her family, the place where she had learned to persist, where she had learned to work without recognition, where she had learned to continue, even when there was no clear path forward. She carried very little with her, a few belongings, some savings, and years of preparation. That was all. The journey to Paris was not just travel, it was transition, from limitation to possibility. But possibility does not remove difficulty, it only changes its form. She would arrive in a place where opportunity existed, but so did hardship, where education was available, but not easy, where progress was possible, but not guaranteed. Still, she went, because staying would have meant accepting the limits placed around her, and she was not willing to do that, not completely, not anymore. So she left, not with certainty, but with intention, and sometimes that is the only beginning there is, a decision to continue, even when the future is unclear, even when the path is difficult, even when the outcome is unknown, because talent alone is not enough, not without opportunity, and opportunity sometimes requires leaving everything behind. Paris was not welcoming, not at first. It did not open its doors. It did not make space for her. It simply existed, busy, indifferent, unconcerned with who arrived or why. When Marie Curie reached the city, she did not arrive as a student in the usual sense. There was no comfort waiting, no prepared place, no sense of belonging, only a goal, to study, and even that was uncertain. The university was there, the lectures were open, the knowledge was available, but access is not the same as ease. She had very little money, less than she needed, and everything in the city required something in return. A room, food, books, time. Nothing was free. She found a place to stay, small, cold, barely furnished, a narrow space under the roof of a building. The kind of room that held more silence than comfort. In winter, the cold settled into the walls. There was no steady heat, no insulation to keep it out. The air inside felt the same as the air outside, sometimes colder. She wore all the clothes she had, not for style, but for warmth. Even then, it was not always enough. At night, the cold did not disappear. It remained, a quiet presence, constant. But she stayed, because leaving would mean giving up the reason she had come. During the day, she attended lectures at University of Paris, large halls, rows of students, voices echoing against high ceilings. This was where knowledge was shared openly, where ideas were discussed without restriction, where questions were not hidden. For her, it was different from everything she had known before. There were no secret classes here, no need to be cautious about what could be said. Learning was visible, structured, recognized. But being there did not make it easy. She was not part of a group, not connected, not supported. She sat quietly, listened carefully, took notes, absorbed everything she could, because she understood something important. She could not afford to miss anything. There was no room for distraction, no time to fall behind. Her position was fragile. Every lesson mattered. Every concept mattered, because each one was hard-earned. After lectures, she returned to her room. There was no break, no separation between study and life. They were the same. She studied at a small table, sometimes with light, sometimes without, depending on what she could afford. Food was limited, not by choice, but by necessity. She counted her expenses carefully. Every coin mattered. Every decision had consequences. There were days when she ate very little, not because she did not need food, but because she needed something else more. Books, paper, access, education required trade-offs, and she made them, quietly, without complaint. Hunger became part of the routine. Not dramatic, not extreme, but present, a steady background to everything she did. Sometimes it affected her concentration, sometimes it slowed her. But she did not stop, because stopping was not an option. There were moments when her body resisted, when the cold and the lack of food combined into exhaustion, when the simplest tasks felt heavy, when thinking clearly required effort, more effort than usual. But she continued, because she had already come too far to turn back. At times she fainted, without warning, a sudden loss of strength, a reminder that the body has limits, that effort alone is not always enough. But even then, she returned, rested when she could, then continued again. This was not a temporary struggle. It lasted for years. Years of managing scarcity, of balancing need and possibility, of choosing education over comfort, again and again. She did not speak about it much. There was no need, because the work itself was the focus, not the conditions around it. She was not trying to prove anything to others. She was trying to continue. That was enough. Her studies were not simple. Physics, mathematics, subjects that required precision, clarity, deep understanding. There was no room for approximation, no place for uncertainty in the final answer, only in the process. She approached them the same way she approached everything, carefully, methodically, patiently. She did not rush. She did not skip steps, because she knew that understanding could not be forced. It had to be built, layer by layer, each concept resting on the one before it. If something was unclear, she returned to it, again and again, until it made sense. This was her strength, not speed, not brilliance in sudden moments, but persistence, the willingness to stay with a problem, to sit with it, to think, to reconsider, until the answer became clear. Over time, the results began to show. Her performance in her studies improved. She stood out, not because she sought attention, but because her work was consistent, accurate, reliable. She completed her degree in physics at the top of her class. This was not expected, not from someone in her position, not from someone working under those conditions, but she had not approached it as something exceptional. For her, it was simply the result of continued effort. There was no moment of celebration, no pause, because there was still more to do. She continued, pursued further studies, expanded her understanding, moved deeper into the subjects that interested her, each step opening new questions, new possibilities, but also new challenges. Because education does not end with one achievement. It continues, expands, becomes more complex. And so did her work. She began to look for opportunities to conduct research, not just to learn what was already known, but to explore what was not yet understood. This was a different kind of effort, less structured, less defined. There were no clear paths, only directions, questions, possibilities, and uncertainty. But uncertainty did not discourage her. It was familiar. She had worked within uncertainty before. She had built her education on it. So she continued, looking for a place, a position, a way to begin. This was not easy. Research required resources, space, support, and she had very little of any of these. But she did not wait for ideal conditions, because they might never come. Instead, she looked for what was available, what was possible, even if it was limited, even if it was temporary, even if it was difficult. Because progress does not always begin with the best tools. Sometimes it begins with whatever is at hand. She found work, small opportunities, tasks that allowed her to stay close to the field she was entering, to remain connected, to continue learning. Even if it was not exactly what she wanted, it was enough, for now, because each step mattered. Each experience added something, even if it was not immediately visible. This is how her path continued, not through sudden change, but through accumulation. Effort added to effort, day after day, year after year. There was no clear moment when everything shifted, no single event that changed everything at once, only gradual progress, the kind that is easy to overlook, but impossible to replace, because it builds something deeper, something stable, something that can support what comes next. By the time she moved further into her work, she had already paid a price, not in one moment, but over time, in comfort, in health, in ease, in everything she had chosen to set aside, for the sake of knowledge, because knowledge, for her, was not just something to acquire, it was something to pursue, even when it was difficult, even when it required sacrifice, even when the cost was not fully known, and sometimes that cost is only understood later, after the work has already begun, after the path has already been chosen, after turning back is no longer an option, because the pursuit of understanding does not ask whether it is easy, only whether it is possible. And if it is, then someone will continue, no matter the cost. Progress did not announce itself. There was no moment where everything suddenly became clear. No clear transition from learning to discovery. Only a gradual shift, from studying what was known to working at the edge of what was not. For Marie Curie, this shift was quiet, almost invisible. There was no formal beginning, no title, no defined role, only work. She had completed her studies. She had proven what she could do. But that did not automatically create opportunity. The world of research was not easily accessible, not without position, not without support, not without recognition, and she had very little of any of these. What she did have was persistence, and a growing interest in a question that had not yet been fully explored. It began with a phenomenon that other scientists had already noticed, a kind of energy emitted by certain materials. It did not depend on heat, it did not depend on light. It seemed to come from within. At the time, it was not well understood. Had been observed, measured, but not deeply explored. Not yet. There were no clear answers, only fragments of understanding. This was where she began. Not with certainty, but with a question. She needed a place to work, somewhere to conduct experiments, somewhere to measure, to observe, to repeat. But space was limited. Resources were limited. So she worked where she could. A room. Not designed for research, not well equipped, but available. It was enough. The conditions were not ideal. The air was often damp, the temperature inconsistent. Equipment was basic, sometimes improvised. But she did not wait for better conditions, because waiting would have meant stopping, and stopping was not acceptable. So she began. The work itself was repetitive, not in a careless way, but in a precise one. Carefully designed experiments, repeated again and again, to confirm results, to eliminate error, to ensure that what she observed was real. This was not visible work. There were no audiences, no recognition, no immediate reward, only data, numbers, measurements, small changes that had to be noticed and recorded. Each experiment added something, but not much, not at first. progress was slow, almost imperceptible, the kind of progress that can be difficult to trust, because it does not look like change. But she continued, because she understood that important work often begins this way, quiet, uncertain, unnoticed. Around her, the scientific community was active. Other researchers published their findings, presented their results, gained recognition. But her work remained largely unseen, not because it lacked value, but because it was still forming, still incomplete, still in process. There is a kind of patience required for this stage, the willingness to continue without acknowledgement, to invest effort without immediate return, to trust that the work itself matters, even when no one else is watching. She worked with instruments that required sensitivity. Measurements had to be exact. Small variations could change the outcome. So she refined her methods, improved her approach, adjusted her techniques, until the results became consistent, reliable. This was her strength. Not dramatic insight, but precision, the ability to observe carefully, to measure accurately, to trust the data, even when it led to unexpected conclusions. Because sometimes the data does not confirm what is expected. Sometimes it suggests something else, something unfamiliar, something difficult to explain, and that is where the work becomes more important, not less. She noticed that certain materials behaved differently. They produced stronger effects, more energy, more activity. This was not random. It was consistent, which meant it could be studied, measured, understood. But it also raised new questions. Why these materials? What made them different? What was happening inside them? There were no clear answers, only possibilities. So she continued to test, to compare, to isolate variables, to reduce uncertainty. Each step narrowing the range of explanation, bringing the question into clearer focus. But still, no recognition. Not yet, because the work was still ongoing, still incomplete. And in science, incomplete work is not enough. It must be proven, demonstrated, repeated, before it can be accepted. This requires time, more time than most people expect. And during that time, the work remains invisible. She was not alone. There was someone who began to take interest in her work, someone who recognized its potential, who saw not just the results, but the method behind them. His name was Marie Curie. He was already an established scientist, experienced, respected. He understood the demands of research, the patience it required, the uncertainty, the slow progress. He did not dismiss her work. He did not overlook it. Instead, he engaged with it, discussed it, supported it. This was important, not as validation, but as collaboration. Because research, at this level, is rarely done alone. It requires exchange, discussion, different perspectives, and together, they began to work more closely, sharing ideas, refining methods, expanding the scope of their experiments. This did not change the nature of the work. It was still slow, still methodical, still largely unseen, but it strengthened it, made it more rigorous, more complete. They focused on materials that showed strong activity. One in particular stood out, a mineral, dark, dense, unremarkable at first glance, but with properties that did not match its appearance. It emitted more energy than expected, more than could be explained by its known composition. This suggested something important, that there was something within it, not yet identified, not yet understood. This was not a conclusion, not yet, only a possibility, but a strong one, strong enough to pursue. So they continued, testing, measuring, breaking the material down, separating its components, looking for the source of the activity. This was difficult work, physical, demanding, not just intellectual. It required effort, time, repetition. Large quantities of material had to be processed, handled, reduced, examined, again and again. There were no shortcuts, no faster method, only persistence. And still, very little recognition. Because from the outside, nothing had changed. There were no dramatic announcements, no clear results, only ongoing work. This is the stage where many efforts end, where the lack of visible progress becomes discouraging, where the absence of recognition begins to matter. But she did not stop, because her motivation was not external. It did not depend on acknowledgement. It did not require success to continue. It was rooted in something else: curiosity, a need to understand, to follow a question to its conclusion, wherever it led, even if that conclusion was uncertain, even if it took years, because some work cannot be rushed. It must be built, slowly, carefully, without certainty, without recognition, until one day something changes, not suddenly, but clearly enough to be seen. A pattern becomes visible, a result becomes consistent, a question becomes an answer. But that moment does not come without what comes before it, without the quiet work, the unseen effort, the long period where nothing seems to happen, because that is where the foundation is built, and without it, there is nothing to discover. Important work is often invisible, not because it lacks value, but because it takes time to become visible, and until it does, it remains what it always was: effort, repeated, refined, continued, without recognition, but not without purpose. At first, it did not seem unusual. Just another measurement, another set of numbers, another result to record. The instrument was simple, sensitive, designed to detect small changes in electrical charge. It responded to invisible forces, forces that could not be seen directly, only measured, only inferred. For Marie Curie, this was familiar work, careful, controlled, repeatable. Each material was tested the same way, placed in position, observed, measured, compared. Most behaved as expected. Some showed small effects, others showed none. But a few were different. Not dramatically, not at first, but consistently. They produced a stronger response, more activity, more energy. It was not random, it was not error, it repeated, again and again. She tested them carefully, adjusted the setup, changed the conditions, measured again. The result remained. There was something in these materials that did not follow the usual patterns. This was not entirely new. Another scientist had already observed a similar effect. A form of energy emitted from certain substances, without heat, without light, without any visible change. But it had not yet been fully understood. It had been noticed, not explained, and that difference matters. Because noticing something is only the beginning. Understanding it is something else. She began to focus on this effect, not as an anomaly, but as a subject, something to explore directly, to define, to measure more precisely, to understand. She needed a way to quantify it, to move beyond observation. So she refined her methods, used instruments that could detect very small electrical changes, measured how strongly different materials affected the surrounding air, compared them, recorded the results, carefully, systematically. This was not guesswork, it was measurement, and the measurements were clear. Some substances produced a much stronger effect than others, even when they appeared similar. even when their composition suggested they should name, not to explain it, but to describe name, not to explain it, but to describe it. Radioactivity, a way to refer to the ability of certain materials to emit energy, continuously, without external influence. The name did not solve the problem, but it allowed it to be studied, defined, shared. This is often how understanding begins, not with answers, but with language, a way to identify what is not yet understood, so that it can be explored further. She continued her work, expanding her measurements, testing more materials, looking for patterns, connections, anything that could provide insight. And something began to emerge, a relationship between the strength of the activity and the amount of a certain element present. Uranium. It was known, studied, but not in this way. She observed that the activity seemed to depend on it. The more uranium in a material, the stronger the effect. This suggested that the energy was not coming from the environment, not from outside, but from within the material itself, from the atoms. This idea was not easy to accept. At the time, atoms were considered stable, unchanging, the smallest units of matter. They were not thought to release energy, not continuously, not without external cause, but the data suggested otherwise, and data, when consistent, is difficult to ignore. She tested other elements. Thorium. It showed similar behavior. This reinforced the idea that the phenomenon was not isolated, not limited to one substance. It was broader, more fundamental. But still, there were inconsistencies. Materials that should have behaved in one way did not. Some showed stronger activity than expected, more than could be explained by their known composition. This was the next question. Why? If uranium and thorium were responsible, then the activity should match their presence. But it did not. Some samples were more active, significantly more, which suggested something else, something hidden, something not yet identified. This is where the work becomes more uncertain, because the data no longer fits the existing explanation, and when that happens, there are two possibilities. The measurements are wrong, or the understanding is incomplete. She considered both, carefully, checked her methods, repeated the experiments, verified the results, again and again. The measurements held, which meant the conclusion had to change. There was something in these materials, beyond what was already known, something producing additional activity, something not yet discovered. This was not a small adjustment. It was a shift, from studying known elements to searching for new ones. But she did not rush to declare anything, because possibility is not proof. It must be demonstrated, clearly, carefully, with evidence that can be repeated. She began to work with a specific mineral, pitchblende, a dense ore, dark, heavy. It contained uranium, but its activity was far greater than uranium alone could explain. This was the key. If the known elements could not account for the behavior, then something else must be present, something contributing to the effect, something hidden within the material. She started to separate it, step by step, breaking it down into its components, testing each one, measuring its activity, looking for the source. This was not simple work. It required time, effort, precision. Each step had to be controlled, each result verified. There was no shortcut, only process and uncertainty. Because at each stage the result could disappear, the activity could weaken, the signal could fade, and the trail would be lost. But it did not. It remained, persistent, as if pointing toward something, something still out of reach. She continued, refining the separation, concentrating the active components, looking for patterns, comparing results. Slowly, very slowly, the evidence began to build. There was something new, something not yet identified, not yet isolated, but present. Its effects were measurable, consistent, real. This was not an assumption. It was a conclusion based on data, but still incomplete, because knowing that something exists is not the same as finding it. She was close, but not yet there, and the closer she came, the more careful she became, because this is the point where errors matter most, where conclusions must be supported, where evidence must be clear. She worked methodically, step by step, following the data, not forcing it, not interpreting it beyond what it showed. This is what made her work reliable, not speed, not intuition, but discipline, the willingness to let the data lead, even when it suggested something unexpected, even when it challenged existing ideas. Because discovery does not always begin with certainty. It often begins with something that does not fit, something that cannot be easily explained, something that remains, even after every attempt to remove it, something strange, not obvious, not fully understood, but impossible to ignore. And that is where she was now, at the edge of understanding, looking at evidence that suggested something new, something hidden, something that would require more work to reveal. But it was there, in the measurements, in the consistency, in the persistence of the effect. She did not yet have the answer, but she had something just as important, a direction, a path forward, and sometimes that is enough. Because every discovery begins the same way, not with clarity, but with confusion, not with certainty, but with a question, something that does not fit, something that remains unexplained, something that asks to be understood. And for those willing to continue, that is where everything begins. The question was no longer abstract. It was no longer just measurement or observation. It had become physical. If something new existed inside the mineral, then it had to be separated. Not imagined, not assumed, but isolated, proven. For Marie Curie, this meant changing the nature of her work. Less theory, more process, less calculation, more labor, because whatever was hidden inside the material, it would not reveal itself easily. The mineral she worked with was called pitchblende, dense, dark, heavy, unremarkable in appearance. But her measurements told a different story. It was far more active than it should have been, more than uranium alone could explain, which meant something else was present, something unknown. But the unknown does not appear on its own. It must be uncovered, and that required effort, a different kind of effort. Not quiet observation, but physical work. Large quantities of the mineral were needed, not small samples, not fragments, but tons. Because, whatever she was looking for, it existed in extremely small amounts, barely detectable, hidden within a much larger mass. So she obtained the material, not refined, not processed, but raw, industrial waste from mining operations, what others had already discarded, because the uranium had been removed. What remained was considered useless, but for her, it was exactly what she needed, because if the activity was greater in what remained, then the source must still be there, hidden, concentrated. She had a place to work, if it could be called that, a shed, large, poorly maintained, with a glass roof that let in light and cold. In winter, it froze. In summer, it became hot and airless. There was no controlled environment. No protection from the elements, only space. And even that was not ideal. The floor was uneven, the equipment was basic, often improvised. But it was enough. Because she was not waiting for better conditions. She had already begun. The work was simple to describe, but difficult to do. The mineral had to be broken down, dissolved, separated into components, each step designed to isolate specific elements, to remove what was known, so that what remained could be studied. This was not a quick process. Each batch required time, careful handling, repeated steps, heating, stirring, filtering, cooling, then measuring, again and again. Large containers filled with dark material, boiled over open flames, stirred with long rods, the air thick with heat and chemical fumes. This was not laboratory work in the usual sense. It was industrial, physical, demanding. She worked through it, day after day, lifting, pouring, mixing, standing for hours, watching, waiting. There was no automation, no assistance from advanced equipment, only manual effort and patience. Always patience, because each step had to be precise, even in those conditions, even when the work was exhausting. Mistakes would not just slow the process, they could erase progress, destroy results. So she remained careful, focused, even when tired, even when the work seemed endless, because in many ways it was. The amount of material was immense, and the substance she was searching for was present in only trace amounts, so small that it could not be seen, not directly, only through its effect, its activity. This meant that progress was slow, painfully slow. After each stage, she measured the activity, looking for an increase, a sign that the substance was becoming more concentrated. Sometimes it did, slightly, almost imperceptibly. Sometimes it did not, which meant the process had to be adjusted, refined, repeated. There was no clear path, no fixed method, only experimentation, trial, error, correction. This continued for years, not weeks, not months, years, the same process, repeated again and again, reducing tons of material to smaller and smaller amounts, each step bringing her closer, but never close enough, not yet. The work demanded endurance, not just intellectual, but physical. Her hands became rough, her body tired. The conditions took their toll, but she did not stop, because the evidence was still there. The activity remained, strong, persistent, a constant signal that something existed within the material, something worth finding. She was not working alone. Marie Curie continued alongside her, sharing the work, the effort, the uncertainty. They divided tasks, supported each other, discussed results, refined their approach together. This made the work possible, not easier, but sustainable, because the scale of the task was too large for one person alone. Still, the progress was slow. At times it must have seemed endless. To continue for so long without clear results requires something more than interest. It requires commitment, a belief that the work matters, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the results are not yet visible. This is where many efforts fail, where the lack of immediate success becomes discouraging, where the effort no longer seems justified. But she did not measure progress that way. She did not expect sudden breakthroughs. She expected gradual change, small improvements, evidence that accumulated over time. And there was evidence, in the measurements, in the increasing activity of certain fractions, in the consistency of the results. They were getting closer, slowly, carefully. The substance she was searching for was becoming more concentrated, more distinct, but still not isolated, still not pure, still not fully understood. This is the nature of such work. The closer you get, the more precise you must be, because small errors become more significant. Small impurities become more important. Everything must be controlled, carefully, deliberately. So she continued, refining the process, reducing the material further, separating components more precisely, measuring each result, tracking each change, until eventually there was something new, not large, not obvious, but different. A fraction of material that behaved in a way that could not be explained by known elements. Its activity was strong, stronger than anything she had measured before. This was not the end, but it was a sign, a confirmation that she was on the right path, that the years of effort were leading somewhere. Still, there was more to do, because identifying a substance is not enough. It must be isolated, proven, characterized. This required even more work, more precision, more patience. Because now, the margin for error was smaller. The amount of material was reduced. Every step mattered more. Every mistake cost more. But she did not change her approach. She continued as she always had, carefully, methodically, without rushing, because the goal was not speed, it was certainty, to prove that something new existed, not as an idea, but as a substance, something real, something that could be measured, studied, understood. This was the work, not a single discovery, but years of effort, layered, repeated, refined, until something emerged, not suddenly, but gradually, built from countless small steps, each one necessary, each one contributing, because breakthroughs are rarely moments. They are processes, long, demanding, often invisible, until they are complete. And even then, what is seen is only the result, not the years that made it possible, not the effort that sustained it, not the patience that carried it forward. But without those years, there is no discovery, only the question, unanswered, and waiting. The change did not arrive suddenly. There was no single moment where everything became clear, no instant where uncertainty disappeared. Instead, there was a shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. For years, Marie Curie had worked with something that could not be seen, only measured, only inferred, an effect, a signal, a persistent activity that pointed toward something hidden. Now, that hidden presence was beginning to take form, not completely, not yet, but enough to be recognized. The material she had been processing, reducing, separating, was no longer just a mixture. Certain fractions behaved differently, more strongly, more consistently. Their activity was no longer uncertain, it was clear, measurable, repeatable, and, most importantly, it could not be explained by anything already known. This was the threshold, the point where possibility becomes evidence, where a question begins to take shape as an answer. But she did not rush, because this was also the point where mistakes could happen, where assumptions could replace proof. And she was careful, always careful. Each fraction was tested again, measured repeatedly, compared against known elements. The results held, they did not fade, they did not change, the activity remained, strong, stable, consistent. This was not error. It was something real, something that could no longer be dismissed. She began to consider what it meant. If the activity could not be explained by uranium, then there must be another source, another element, something not yet identified. But to claim that required more than observation. It required proof. Not just that something existed, but that it was distinct, that it could be separated, that it had its own properties, its own identity. So the work continued. But now it was more focused, more precise. The goal was no longer just to follow the activity. It was to isolate it, to bring it into a form that could be studied directly. This required further refinement, further separation, reducing the material again, removing what was known, leaving only what was new. Each step became more demanding, because the amount of material was now very small, and the substance within it even smaller. A trace, barely present, but still measurable, still persistent. This was enough to continue, enough to justify the effort, enough to move forward. At this stage, the work was not just physical, it required interpretation, understanding the results, connecting them, building a case. Because in science, evidence must be structured, clear, convincing, not just observed, but demonstrated. She began to organize her findings, not as isolated results, but as a system, a set of observations that pointed in the same direction. The activity increased with certain fractions, decreased with others, followed specific patterns. This consistency was important, because it suggested that the source was not random, not diffuse, but concentrated, localized within the material, and that meant it could be identified. She proposed something that had not yet been proven, that within the material there existed a new element, one that produced strong radioactivity, one that had not yet been discovered. This was not a conclusion made lightly. It was based on years of work, years of measurement, years of careful observation. But even then, it was still a proposal. It needed confirmation. And confirmation required more work, more evidence, more precision. She continued, refining the process, concentrating the active material further, until the signal became stronger, clearer, more distinct, and eventually, it reached a point where it could no longer be explained as a mixture. The properties were different, the behavior was different. This was not uranium, not thorium, something else, something new. She gave it a name, polonium, not randomly, not arbitrarily, but deliberately, named after her homeland, Poland, a place that, like her discovery, was not fully recognized, not fully acknowledged. At the time, the name carried meaning, not just scientific, but personal, a quiet acknowledgement of where she came from and what had shaped her. But the work did not end there, because polonium was only part of the answer. There was still more, another source of activity, stronger, more persistent, more difficult to isolate. She continued to work, to refine, to separate, until eventually another substance emerged, more powerful than anything she had seen before. Its activity was intense, constant, unmistakable. This was the second breakthrough, another new element, one that would become even more significant. She named it radium. At this point, the evidence was clear. Not just one new element, but two, both producing strong radioactivity, both previously unknown. This was no longer a question, it was a discovery. But discovery alone is not enough. It must be shared, presented, examined by others, tested, confirmed. So she published her findings, carefully, clearly, describing the methods, the measurements, the conclusions. This was the moment where her work became visible, where it moved from the laboratory into the wider scientific community, where others could see what she had done and respond. Not everyone accepted it immediately, because the implications were significant. If atoms could emit energy, then they were not stable, not fixed, not unchanging. This challenged existing ideas, required new thinking, new understanding, but the evidence was strong, and it continued to grow. Other scientists repeated her work, verified the results, confirmed the existence of the new elements, and gradually, acceptance followed. What had begun as a question, a small inconsistency in measurement, had become something much larger, a discovery that would change how matter itself was understood. But for her, the breakthrough was not a moment of completion. It was a transition, from searching to understanding, from uncertainty to proof. And even then, it was not the end, because every answer leads to new questions. Every discovery opens new paths, and what she had found was not just two new elements. It was a new way of looking at the world, a recognition that matter was not static, not fixed, but active, changing, releasing energy from within, quietly, continuously. The glow she had observed was no longer a mystery. It had a source, a name, a place within the structure of matter, and that changed everything, because proof does not just answer a question, it changes what can be asked next. The work was no longer invisible. What had begun in a dim, improvised space, measured quietly, repeated patiently, was now being seen, discussed, examined. The discovery of new elements could not remain hidden, not for long. The scientific community began to respond, at first cautiously, then with increasing attention, because the implications were difficult to ignore. If atoms could release energy, if they were not stable, then something fundamental had changed, not just in chemistry, not just in physics, but in the way matter itself was understood. For Marie Curie, this brought something new, recognition, not immediate, not complete, but growing. Her work was being cited, discussed in academic circles, repeated by other researchers, confirmed. This is how discovery becomes accepted, not through declaration, but through verification. When others can observe the same results, measure the same effects, reach the same conclusions, then the work becomes part of knowledge, and her work was becoming that. Slowly, but clearly. There were invitations, requests to present findings, to explain methods, to contribute to discussions that extended beyond her own laboratory. This was a change, from working in isolation to being part of a wider conversation. But recognition does not arrive without complication. It does not remove what came before. It does not erase existing barriers. It simply exists alongside them. In 1903, a decision was made to award the Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of radiation, the recognition of a field that had not existed before. The names considered were not surprising. Henri Becquerel, who had first observed the phenomenon, and Marie Curie, whose work had contributed significantly to its development. Their roles were visible, acknowledged, established, but her name was not initially included. Not because her work was unknown, not because it lacked importance, but because recognition does not always follow contribution. It follows perception, and perception is shaped by expectation. At that time, the idea of a woman receiving such recognition was not widely accepted, not in the same way, not with the same ease. Her work had been essential, central, but it was not automatically seen that way. This is how resistance appears, not always direct, not always stated, but present, in what is included and what is left out. The decision might have remained unchanged, unquestioned, if not for intervention. Pierre Curie became aware of the omission, and he did not accept it, because he understood the work not as separate contributions, but as shared effort. He insisted, clearly, that her role be recognized, that her name be included, because without it, the account would not be accurate. This mattered, not as a gesture, but as correction. Recognition must reflect reality, otherwise it becomes distortion. Eventually, the decision was changed. Her name was added, and in that moment, she became the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize, not as an exception, but as a scientist, whose work had met the same standards, the same level of evidence, the same level of impact. This was significant, but it did not change everything, because recognition does not remove resistance. It does not transform attitudes immediately. It does not erase assumptions. It simply adds another layer, another fact that must be acknowledged. There were still doubts, still questions, not about the data, but about the person. Her position remained unusual, her presence in academic spaces still not fully accepted. She was often observed differently, evaluated differently, her work examined with a different kind of scrutiny, not necessarily more rigorous, but more questioning, more uncertain, as if it required additional validation. This is not always visible, but it is felt in conversations, in expectations, in the way contributions are received. She did not respond with argument or confrontation. She continued her work, presented her findings, engaged with the scientific community, through the same methods she had always used: careful evidence, clear explanation, consistent results, because in the end, that is what matters. Not perception, but proof. Her reputation continued to grow, not quickly, but steadily, because her work remained reliable, repeatable, substantial. It did not depend on recognition. It produced it over time. This is how credibility is built, not through visibility alone, but through consistency, through work that can be trusted, work that holds, even under scrutiny. She continued to publish, to teach, to expand the field she had helped create. Radioactivity was no longer a question. It was a subject, a field of study, with methods, with data, with direction, and she was at its center. Not because she sought that position, but because her work placed her there. Still, there were limits, positions that were difficult to access, roles that were not easily granted, even with recognition, even with achievement, because systems change slowly, and individuals often move faster than the structures around them. She continued, not waiting for full acceptance, not expecting it, because waiting would slow the work, and the work was what mattered. Always, the recognition she received was real, important, but incomplete, because it existed within a context that had not yet fully adjusted, that had not yet fully opened. And so, her path remained the same. Continue, produce, demonstrate, allow the work to speak, because over time, evidence has its own influence. It shifts perception, changes expectation, expands what is considered possible, not immediately, but gradually, through repetition, through consistency, through results that cannot be ignored. She did not change her approach, because she did not need to. The work was enough. It had always been enough. Recognition acknowledged it. Resistance challenged it, but neither defined it, because the value of the work did not depend on either. It existed independently, and that is what allowed it to continue, to grow, to shape what came next, because recognition may open doors, but it does not remove obstacles. It simply changes their form. And for those who continue, that difference is understood. Quietly, without distraction, because the work remains, and the work is what endures. Loss does not announce itself. It does not arrive with preparation. It does not wait for the right moment. It simply happens, and everything after it is different. By the time this moment came, Marie Curie had built a life that was not separate from her work. It was part of it, integrated, continuous. Her days were structured around research, around teaching, around the careful progression of ideas into results, and within that structure, there was partnership, not just in life, but in work. Pierre Curie was not simply a collaborator. He was part of the process, part of the thinking, part of the effort that had led to everything they had achieved. Their work was shared, ideas discussed, experiments planned together, results examined together. There was a rhythm to it, not always easy, not always smooth, but steady, reliable, and over time it became something constant, something expected, something that did not need to be questioned, because it was always there. And then it was not. The event itself was sudden, an accident, unexpected, final. There was no transition, no gradual change, no time to adjust. One moment he was present, the next he was gone. This is the nature of sudden loss. It does not allow for preparation. It interrupts. It removes something essential, without warning. For her, the change was immediate, not only personal, but structural. The work did not disappear. The responsibilities did not lessen. But the person who had shared them was no longer there. This creates a different kind of absence. Not just emotional, but practical. There are decisions that must still be made, work that must still be continued, questions that still require answers. But now, they are faced alone. The laboratory remained, the materials, the instruments, the notes, everything that had been built was still there, unchanged. But the way it was experienced was not. Silence becomes different, more noticeable, more present. Because what is missing is not replaced. There is no immediate adjustment, no clear way to continue, only the fact that continuation is necessary. She did not stop, not entirely. There was a period of pause, of absence, because loss cannot be ignored. It changes attention, focus, energy. But the work remained, and in time, she returned to it. Not because it was easy, not because it provided comfort, but because it was part of what remained, part of what continued. She took on his position, not as a symbolic act, but as a practical one. The work required it, the institution required it, and she was capable. This was not a simple transition, because stepping into a role is not the same as sharing it. The responsibility was now hers, fully. The decisions, the direction, the continuation of the research. There was no division, no shared process, only her and the work. She continued to teach, to guide students, to maintain the structure that had been built. Because knowledge does not pause, it continues, regardless of circumstance, and those who are part of it often continue as well. Not because they are unaffected, but because the work demands it. Her approach did not change, not in method, not in discipline. She remained careful, precise, focused, because that was how she had always worked. But there was a difference, not visible, not measurable, but present, a change in the context of the work, a shift in what it meant to continue. Because continuing after loss is not the same as continuing before it. The same actions carry different weight, the same routines, feel different, but they remain, and over time they become a way forward, not a solution, but a path. The work expanded. The field of radioactivity was growing. New questions, new possibilities, new areas to explore, and she remained at its center, contributing, leading, developing the ideas that had begun years earlier. This was not a return to what had been. It was a continuation, in a different form, without the partnership that had shaped the earlier work, but not without direction, because the foundation had already been built, and it remained in the methods, in the understanding, in the approach to research. She carried that forward, not as memory, but as practice, embedded in the way she worked, in the way she approached problems, in the way she evaluated results. This is how some forms of continuity exist, not in presence, but in influence, in what remains after someone is gone. There were moments of recognition, of acknowledgement, from others, from institutions, from those who understood the significance of what had been lost. But recognition does not replace absence. It does not restore what is gone. It only observes it, from the outside. And so, she continued, not because the loss had been resolved, but because it could not be. Some things are not resolved. They are carried, integrated, becoming part of the path forward, without being removed from it. Her work did not slow, it did not diminish. If anything, it became more focused, more directed, because the responsibility was now singular, clear. There was no division of effort, no shared decision-making, only her, and what needed to be done. This is a different kind of continuation, not driven by partnership, but by commitment, to the work itself, to the questions that remain, to the process that does not end. Even when circumstances change, even when something essential is lost, because knowledge does not depend on stability. It does not require ideal conditions. It continues, through those who choose to continue it. And she did, not as an act of resistance, not as a statement, but as a continuation of what had already begun, because the work was still there, the questions were still there, and the answers had not yet been fully found. Loss does not stop the process. It changes it, alters its form, but it does not remove the need to continue. And so, she did, quietly, without declaration, carrying both the work and what had been lost. At the same time, the glow was still there, faint, steady, unchanging. It had once been a question, then a discovery. Now, it was something else, something present in every part of the work, in the materials, in the instruments, in the air. For Marie Curie it had become familiar, not fully understood, but no longer strange. Radioactivity was no longer just a phenomenon to observe. It was something to handle, to work with directly, to measure, to isolate, to store. Small samples were kept in glass containers, placed on tables, carried between rooms, used in experiments, examined under different conditions. There was no special protection, no shielding, no clear sense of distance, because the nature of the danger was not yet known. The effects were invisible. There was no heat, no smell, no immediate signal of harm. Only the same quiet emission, the same faint glow in the dark. It did not behave like fire. It did not burn in a way that could be seen, so it did not feel dangerous, not in the usual sense. This is how some risks exist, without warning, without clear signs. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand attention, they simply remain, working slowly, quietly, over time. She handled the materials directly, moved them, measured them, sometimes carrying small containers in her pockets, not as carelessness, but as routine. Because there was no reason, at the time, to think otherwise. The work required proximity, required contact, required repeated interaction, and so that is how it was done. Day after day, year after year, the effects were subtle. At first, a sense of fatigue, occasional discomfort, nothing that could be clearly connected to the work, nothing that suggested a specific cause, because the connection had not yet been made. There were no established patterns, no recognized symptoms, no framework to understand what was happening. So the work continued, unchanged. She noticed that her hands were affected, skin that became irritated, sometimes damaged, slow to heal. This was unusual, but not fully understood. It could be explained in many ways. Fatigue, chemicals, the physical demands of the work. There was no single cause that stood out. No clear link to radioactivity itself, because the idea that something invisible could affect the body over time was not yet established. Others working in the same field observed similar effects. Minor injuries, unexplained symptoms, but they were not connected, not immediately. Each case seen in isolation, without a unifying explanation. This is how understanding often develops, not from one clear observation, but from many small ones, spread across time, across different people, until a pattern begins to emerge. But that pattern had not yet formed. Not fully. So the work continued. Samples of radium were studied, their properties examined, their effects measured. The glow, in particular, remained fascinating. It could be seen in the dark. A soft, blue-green light. Continuous. Unfading. Unlike anything else. It seemed almost alive, as if the material itself contained energy, releasing it slowly without being consumed. This made it seem harmless, even appealing. It did not behave like something dangerous. It did not degrade. It did not diminish quickly. It remained stable, predictable, reliable. These are not qualities that suggest risk. They suggest usefulness, potential. And so attention turned toward application. What could this energy be used for? What could it reveal? How could it be applied? The focus remained on possibility, not on consequence, because consequence was not yet visible. Not clearly, not consistently. Time passed, and the effects accumulated, slowly, without clear boundaries, without a single moment where everything changed. This is how long-term exposure works. It does not announce itself. It builds, quietly, until the effects can no longer be ignored. But by then, the exposure has already occurred. The work had been done, repeatedly, over years, without protection, without awareness. Because awareness requires knowledge, and knowledge takes time. The field itself was new, the understanding incomplete. There were no guidelines, no established safety measures, no history to draw from, only the work itself, and what it revealed. Gradually, the connection began to form between the materials and the effects, between exposure and harm. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to suggest that something more was happening, something beyond the immediate observations, something that required caution. But by then, the habits were already established, the methods already in place, the work already done. This is the challenge of discovery, that the consequences are not always known in advance. That understanding comes after, sometimes long after the work has been completed, after the exposure has occurred, after the cost has already been paid. She continued, not because she was unaware of difficulty, but because the full nature of the risk was still not clear, still not fully understood. There was no precise measurement of danger, no defined threshold, no clear line between safe and unsafe, only increasing awareness, gradual, incomplete, and still developing. Her work remained focused on understanding radioactivity, on exploring its properties, on extending its applications, because the potential was significant. The ability to see inside the body, to detect conditions not visible from the outside, to use radiation as a tool. These were possibilities that could not be ignored, and so the work continued, balancing discovery with an emerging awareness of risk, but not yet fully defined, not yet fully understood. The glow remained, as it always had, soft, steady, unchanging, but now it carried a different meaning, not just a sign of discovery, but a sign of something else, something less visible, less immediate, but just as real. Because what cannot be seen is not always harmless, and what is not understood does not remain without consequence. The energy she had studied, measured, isolated, was not just a subject of research. It was something that affected the world around it, and those who worked with it, quietly, over time, without announcement, without warning, until understanding finally began to catch up. But by then, the work had already been done, and the cost had already begun to take form. War changes the meaning of knowledge. What begins as theory, as observation, as careful, controlled study, becomes something else, urgent, practical, immediate. When the war began, the work of Marie Curie had already reshaped science. Radioactivity was no longer an idea. It was understood, measured, applied in laboratories, but its wider use was still developing. The focus had been on discovery, on understanding the nature of matter. Now the question changed. How could this knowledge be used? Not in theory, but in reality, on a battlefield, where time was limited, where decisions had immediate consequences, where uncertainty could cost lives. The problem was simple to describe, but difficult to solve. Soldiers were injured, severely, often in ways that could not be fully assessed from the outside. Bullets, fragments, internal damage. Doctors needed to see inside the body, to locate injuries, to understand what could not be observed directly. There was a technology that could do this. X-rays, discovered years earlier, capable of passing through the body, revealing structures beneath the surface. But there was a limitation. X-ray equipment was not easily available, not near the front, not where it was most needed. Hospitals farther from the battlefield had access, but by the time the wounded reached them, it was often too late. What was needed was proximity, the ability to bring this technology closer, to the place where it could make a difference. This required change, not in the science itself, but in its application. The equipment had to move, to travel, to operate outside controlled environments, in conditions that were unpredictable, unstable, difficult. This was not how it had been designed, but it was possible, with adaptation, with effort, with organization. She began to focus on this problem, not as a scientist observing from a distance, but as someone directly involved, identifying what was needed and working to provide it. Mobile units, vehicles equipped with X-ray machines, power sources, equipment that could be transported, set up quickly, used effectively. This was not simple. It required design, modification, training, because the equipment itself was only part of the solution. People needed to know how to use it, how to operate it safely, how to interpret the images it produced. This required education, and she took part in that as well, training others, explaining the process, ensuring that the technology could be used where it was needed most. She worked to organize these efforts, to secure resources, to coordinate deployment. This was a different kind of work. Less focused on discovery, more focused on implementation, on making something practical, functional, useful. The units were deployed, close to the front, where injuries were immediate, where time mattered, where information could change outcomes. Doctors used them to locate bullets, to identify fractures, to understand internal injuries. This improved treatment, allowed for more precise decisions, reduced uncertainty, and, in many cases, saved lives. The impact was not abstract. It was direct, immediate, visible. This is the difference between discovery and application. One expands understanding, the other changes outcomes. She did not remain distant from this work. She was involved, traveling, supervising, ensuring that the systems functioned, that the equipment was used correctly, that the effort continued, even under difficult conditions. Her daughter, Irene Joliot-Curie, also became involved, assisting, learning, participating in the work. This was not confined to one person. It became a shared effort, extending beyond the laboratory, into the field, where knowledge met necessity. The work was demanding. Conditions were not controlled. The environment was unstable. There were risks, technical, physical, operational, but the purpose was clear: to make use of what had been discovered, to apply it where it could have immediate value. This required adaptability, the ability to adjust, to solve problems as they arose, to continue despite difficulty, because the situation did not allow for delay. The need was constant, and the response had to match it. Over time, these mobile units became more common, more organized, more effective. They were known informally as Little Curies, not as a title, but as a reference to their origin, to the work that made them possible, to the person who had driven their development. Their presence changed medical practice in the field, provided access to imaging where it had not existed before, reduced uncertainty, improved outcomes, not in every case, but in many. And that was enough to matter. This was not the kind of recognition found in academic circles. There were no formal presentations, no publications associated with each use, only results, practical, immediate, measured in outcomes rather than theory. This is a different form of contribution, less visible, but less important, because it affects lives directly, in ways that cannot be easily quantified. Her work during this period did not replace her scientific research, but it expanded its meaning, demonstrated that discovery is not only about understanding, but about use, about application, about translating knowledge into action, especially when the need is urgent, when the context changes, when the environment demands more than theory. War does not create knowledge, but it changes how knowledge is used. It accelerates application, forces adaptation, requires solutions that work under pressure. And in that context, her work found a new form, not in quiet laboratories, but in moving vehicles, temporary installations, uncertain conditions, where the goal was not to discover something new, but to use what was already known, effectively, quickly, with purpose. Because knowledge, once established, does not remain static. It moves, it adapts, it finds new uses, sometimes far from where it began. And in those moments, its value becomes visible, not in theory, but in practice, in outcomes, in the difference it makes. And that is where her work had arrived, from observation to discovery to application, a progression that changed not just science, but lives, in ways that were immediate and lasting. The work did not stop. It continued, year after year, experiment after experiment. The questions changed, the methods improved, the field expanded, but the process remained the same. Careful, deliberate, persistent. For Marie Curie, this was not a phase. It was a way of working, a way of living. The laboratory was still central, the materials still present, the measurements still ongoing. Radioactivity had become a field, a discipline, studied by others, expanded beyond its origins. But she remained within it, continuing to refine, to explore, to understand more deeply. This is what happens after discovery. It does not end, it extends, becomes more complex, more detailed, and those who began it often continue within it. Not because they must, but because the work is not finished. There are always more questions, more details to understand, more connections to explore, but over time, something else began to change, not in the work, but in her. At first, it was not clear, not obvious. The changes were gradual, subtle, easy to overlook. Fatigue, more persistent than before, a sense of exhaustion that did not fully pass, even with rest. This was not unusual. The work was demanding, physically, mentally. It required focus, effort, long periods of concentration. So fatigue could be explained as part of the process, but it did not remain limited. There were other changes, difficult to define, difficult to connect, because they did not point clearly to a single cause. This is how long-term effects appear, not as a single event, but as a series of small changes, accumulating over time, without clear boundaries, without a precise beginning. Her hands had already shown signs of damage, years earlier. Skin affected by repeated exposure, slow to heal, easily irritated. These were early indications, but they had not been fully understood, not connected to a larger pattern. Now, the pattern was becoming clearer, but only gradually, because the understanding of radiation was still developing. Its effects on the body were not fully known, not measured precisely, not predicted. There were observations, reports, similar experiences from others working in the same field, but no complete framework, no clear model to explain everything. So the connection remained incomplete, even as the effects continued. She did not stop working, not because she was unaware of change, but because the work was ongoing. The field was still developing. There was more to do, more to understand, and stopping would not change what had already occurred. The exposure had already happened, over years, in ways that could not be reversed. This is the nature of certain costs. They are not immediate. They do not appear at the moment of action. They develop over time. And by the time they are recognized, they are already part of the outcome. Her condition became more serious. Gradually, not suddenly, there was no single moment of transition, only progression. From mild symptoms to more significant ones, from manageable to limiting. But even then, she continued, as much as she could, maintaining involvement, remaining connected to the work, because it was not separate from her. It had never been. Her notebooks remained, filled with records, measurements, observations, work accumulated over years. They were still active, still carried the same properties she had studied, still emitting radiation, quietly, continuously, as they always had. This is one of the lasting traces of her work, not just the discoveries, but the materials themselves, still active, still present. Long after the experiments were completed, a reminder of what had been handled, what had been studied, what had been understood, and what had not. The understanding of radiation's effects improved, over time, through further research, through observation, through the accumulation of data. But this came later, after the initial discoveries, after the years of exposure, after the work had already been done. This is often the sequence: discovery first, understanding later, and sometimes the cost is paid in the space between. Her health continued to decline, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, until it could no longer be ignored, until it became clear that the work had not been without consequence, that the materials she had studied had affected her, not immediately, but over time. This was not a failure, not a mistake in the usual sense, because the knowledge had not been available. The risks had not been fully understood. The field itself was new, without history, without precedent, and so the work had been done, without the protections that would come later. This is how early discovery often works. It moves ahead of understanding, explores before all consequences are known, and in doing so, it carries uncertainty, sometimes risk, sometimes cost. Her condition reached a point where continuation was no longer possible, where the work had to stop, not by choice, but by necessity, because the body has limits, even when the work does not. She died in 1934. The cause was identified later, related to prolonged exposure to radiation, the same phenomenon she had studied, measured, named. This is not a simple conclusion, not a direct exchange, discovery for cost. Because the relationship is more complex. The work she did expanded understanding, changed science, enabled new applications, including those that would later be used to treat disease, to diagnose, to improve outcomes. The same phenomenon that caused harm also created possibility. This is the nature of knowledge. It is not defined by a single effect. It has multiple outcomes, some beneficial, some harmful, often both. What she discovered did not remain within the laboratory. It extended into medicine, into technology, into fields that would develop long after her work. But the cost was personal, not abstract, not distant. It was carried by her, over time, through the years of exposure, through the absence of protection, through the pursuit of understanding, before all consequences were known. This is not unusual in the history of discovery. Those who work at the edge of knowledge often encounter what is not yet understood, and in that space there is uncertainty, risk, because the boundaries are not yet defined, the effects not yet fully known, and yet the work continues, because without it there is no progress, no expansion of understanding, no movement forward. The cost is not always visible at the beginning. It becomes clear later, after the work is done, after the discovery is made, after the impact has begun to unfold, and by then it is already part of the story, not separate from it, but connected to it, because discovery does not exist without consequence. It changes understanding, but it also reveals what was previously unknown, including risk, including cost. And in that sense, the work was complete, not only in what it revealed about the world, but in what it required, quietly, over time, without being fully understood, until it was too late to change it. The laboratory is quiet again, not empty, but still. The instruments remain, the notebooks, the glass containers, everything arranged as it once was, carefully, deliberately, as if the work might continue at any moment. But something has changed, not in the materials, not in the space, but in the absence of the person who once stood there. For years, Marie Curie had worked within rooms like this, measuring, recording, repeating, not seeking attention, not seeking recognition, only understanding. What she discovered did not begin as something large. It was small, a faint effect, a measurement that did not fit expectations, something easy to overlook, something that could have been dismissed. But it was not, because she stayed with it, followed it, measured it again and again, until it became clear. This is how her work began, quietly, without announcement, without certainty, and over time it grew, from observation to discovery to a field of study. Radioactivity was not just identified. It was defined, measured, understood in ways that had not existed before. It changed how matter itself was seen, no longer stable, no longer fixed, but active, capable of releasing energy, continuously, from within. This changed science, not in one moment, but over time. As the implications were explored, as the ideas were expanded, as others built on what she had done. Because discovery does not end with the person who makes it, it continues, through those who follow, through those who extend it, refine it, apply it. Her work became part of that process, integrated into the structure of modern science, not separate, not isolated, but foundational. It influenced physics, chemistry, medicine, fields that would continue to develop long after her work had ended. The ability to understand radiation led to new methods of diagnosis, new approaches to treatment, new ways of seeing what could not be seen before. Inside the human body, within materials, at levels that had previously been inaccessible. These applications were not immediate. They developed over time. As understanding increased, as technology improved, as knowledge expanded, but they were connected, directly, to the work she had begun. This is how impact exists, not always visible at the beginning, but growing, extending, reaching beyond its origin. Her influence was not limited to discovery. It also changed who could participate, who could contribute, what was considered possible, her presence in science. At a time when it was not expected, expanded that space, not through argument, but through work, through results that could not be ignored, through contributions that met the same standards as anyone else. This did not immediately change everything, but it created a point of reference, an example, something that could not be dismissed. And, over time, that matters, because change does not always happen quickly. It accumulates, builds, through repeated examples, through consistent evidence, through the expansion of what is recognized. Her work also left something less visible, a reminder of the cost that can accompany discovery, that understanding does not always come before consequence, that some effects are only recognized later, after the work has been done, after the exposure has occurred. This changed how future research was conducted, how materials were handled, how risk was understood, safety measures developed, standards established, protections introduced, because of what had been learned, not only through theory, but through experience. This is part of her legacy as well, not only what was discovered, but what was learned, about how discovery should be approached, with awareness, with caution, with understanding of what may not yet be visible. The notebooks remain, still preserved, still containing the records of her work. They are not just historical documents, they are part of the process, evidence of how discovery is built. Step by step, observation by observation, without certainty, but with persistence. They still carry traces of what she studied, a physical reminder that the work was real, that it had effects, that it continues to exist, in ways that are not always visible. This is how her work remains, not only in history, but in practice, in the methods used today, in the understanding that has developed from it, in the applications that continue to evolve. Her name is associated with these discoveries, but the work itself goes beyond any one person. It has become part of a larger system, a body of knowledge that continues to grow, that continues to change, that continues to be refined. This is what remains, not just what was found, but what it made possible, the questions it opened, the paths it created, the understanding it allowed. Because discovery does not end, it extends, beyond the moment it is made, beyond the person who makes it, into everything that follows. The laboratory may be quiet. The work that began there is not. It continues, in different places, in different forms, with new questions, new methods, new understanding, but connected to what came before, to the moment when something was first observed, measured, followed, until it became clear. What she discovered outlived her, and changed the world forever.